to make new things happen. So that's a challenge that you will encounter. I would argue too, though, that by putting solid programs in place, especially in in the area of mental health, you we do end up saving dollars down the road by intervening early and providing services for kids in early stages of need. Limited staff, that's always a challenge as well. And we can kind of work with that limitation by looking at existing staff and see how we can tap into the skills and expertise and credentials of staff already on board that we can utilize in a mental health program. Administration and staff perception of the scope of practice. Sometimes there's a challenge in viewing school-based mental health professionals as such. For example, school counselors' typical role may be more around guidance and registration and scheduling, and it's okay to look at their training and background as a mental health service provider, especially if that is their area of interest or they've developed those skills to provide those services in a school setting, in addition to the more quasi-administrative tasks that they perform. And finally, the stigma and fears about mental health and mental illness. Especially when it comes to young children, we're not used to thinking of uh, elementary, even preschool age children as having mental health and wellness needs, and when in fact they do. And so helping to kind of reform that perspective among administrators and staff so that we recognize needs when we see them is another challenge that we can work on in building mental health programs.
And this is a worksheet just to kind of help conceptualize how a mental health program fits into the tiers that we're familiar with academically. I'm sure everyone already knows these. And then behavioral and social emotional, again, it's hard to really compartmentalize them. They're so interrelated. But some examples of tier one behavioral supports might be positive rules, positively stated rules and natural consequences. Tier two, check in, check out. Um, not like scheduled counseling sessions so much as just starting and ending their day, making sure that they're doing okay, and targeted group instruction. And then in terms of tier one for social emotional development, that's just social emotional learning in general, and curriculum. Mindfulness practices like morning meetings and identifying how they're feeling, fostering a growth mindset.
Mhm.
And then,
Uh,
yes, Maria?
yeah, I'll jump in at this point. One of the main kind of key idea that we wanted to promote for you in using this visual is the importance when you're pulling a program together of having a tangible progression. So your progression along the social emotional domain may not look exactly like mine or like the one that we've presented here with some example ideas. But the important thing in order to build your infrastructure is that you have an idea of what your progression of services are, be they tier one universal services, as Allison explained, tier two, in more strategic services for small group or individual early stage intervention, such as being a liaison between a school team and a community provider, providing check-ins or very brief counseling for individuals or small groups. Case management, assisting with managing outside services within the school setting, very kind of light early stage supports, all the way into tier three, which is more the traditional referral for special education and intensive services with more comprehensive and complex treatment and supports for the student. So these are some ideas, and we would encourage you to use this kind of visual to help you conceptualize your own infrastructure and moving along in that continuum of tier 1 through tier 3.
Allison and Maria, we have a question about how to offer mental health supports with increasing concerns during school closures, during COVID. So when it's appropriate, if you could talk about that.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah. Do you want to field that, or you want to start that off, Allison? Or
These days, the most important thing is to have a plan in place, like make sure that the school or the school staff really has a system. So that can look different depending on your school population and even technological availability for your students. But one idea, Maria and I were discussing this the other day. I have not yet had to do a 5150 on a student experiencing a mental health crisis, but she has. And so, Maria, would you be willing to explain what that looked like, what that involved?
Sure. I think the important thing, especially during this challenging time of being remote with all of our contacts, is first of all to know before there's a crisis, who are your high risk students? Who are your students that are on your radar already, that have had a history of psychological or psychiatric incidents or need events at school or outside of school, who are kind of on your watch list? And make sure that you have a good safety net of contact information for that child in case of an emergency. So how do you reach a parent directly? How do you reach another person on their emergency form in the event that a parent is not available? Do you have a number for and a release to speak with their pediatrician? Do you know, do you have handy the contact information for your local police department in the event that you have to request a safety check for that child? And then if you, in your interactions with that child, if you do feel like they are at risk of hurting themselves or someone else, and would meet the criteria in person for intervening, then you have everything available at your fingertips to activate the intervention for that child. And the important thing in the remote situation is to make sure that you keep all your communication loops intact and active. Make sure you're able to consult with your supervisor, make sure that you have, you maintain your open connection with the parent or guardian of that child. Make sure to keep all the parties who need to know what's happened with the child informed, and that you do a follow-up either by virtual or by phone, so that there can be a reintroduction of the student back into the learning situation when they're able to. So it is the steps themselves are exactly the same as you would do in person. The complication, of course, is the added planning and thinking ahead that you have to do because of the virtual setting.
And going back to contact information, generally we do have available parent contacts, but these days sometimes students are not home. They're in a different setting than they would normally be because everything is virtual. So for those higher risk or even suspiciously, like students who seem very withdrawn, and those tend to be the ones these days who are easier to kind of fall through the cracks, because it seems like, oh, they're attending class, they're just staying quiet, and maybe you don't know that that's different from their norm. You don't know that previously they were bubbly and socially interacted very well. So being sure that you know where they are to the best of your ability, if you can get updated. So are you home these days? Just figuring out, talking with parent in advance to make sure that you have a good idea of where they're located.
I think does that answer you? I think that answers the question.
Yeah, and if not, I mean, as questions arise, as you all been doing, feel free to put them in the chat and we can elaborate as needed. So then more information on conceptualizing infrastructure in tier 1. So positively stated rules, I'm betting being educators, you're all familiar with this, but in case not, it's stating at the tier 1 level, so this is universal, what everyone has access to, stating what you want students to do, not what you don't want students to do. Tell them the target behavior. Having a consistent system of reinforcement, as one of my friends who's a licensed clinical social worker likes to remind me, predictability is the foundation of trust. If students know what the expectation is and the consequences if they do not meet that expectation, that even if they get into trouble, so to speak, you know, or whatever we're doing these days as a consequence, they'll that still builds trust. That still makes them feel safe because they know, okay, well, if this happens, then this is going to be the result. And then teaching social skills and conflict resolution in advance. You can build that into the curriculum. During reading is a great time to build in that sort of learning, and it can be interactive. Again, all students receive this. And then in terms of delivery, all school staff, this is not just educators, this is not just like the mental health support on the staff, if this is everyone, and even the school community. Every school community is unique. Every school community has different demographics, different overarching values. So keeping that in mind, if you are addressing the values of the general school community, you'll have more buy-in from parents and then even more support. This is even more likely to be successful if all hands are on deck, so to speak. And then in terms of tier 2, so this is at the intervention level, usually small group. It can include short-term interventions. It can be for chronic needs. If the student has an IEP, but maybe that IEP is not for something that's social, emotional, behavioral specifically. Maybe they have an identified, academic need or cognitive deficit, but it's noted that they might need some level of support social emotionally in terms of their mental health, then that would still be appropriate. Same with 504. And also for crisis, some students don't need special education. They're just going through something very hard. And so you want to make sure you know in advance how to support those students.
And again, I think because of the current virtual situation and we know that with COVID there has been an increased level of anxiety and depression among children of all ages. So you may find that there are more of these kind of acute incidents that happen either now or as we start to return to a in-person school situation at some point. In terms of how to identify who receives services, keep in mind again that you're building your infrastructure here, and the tier 2, it can be the entry level into more intensive support services for students. The importance of building a referral process for your program is multi purpose. One is that it helps to build consistency with how you identify children who should receive this next level of support or will need this next level of support. Again, to help you manage resources and to be equitable about how the resources are used. Your referral process, whatever that might be, should be very user friendly. Your consumer, so to speak, will be the general, special general education teaching staff and administrators, and we want to be mindful of not adding to their workload and making a very complex referral process. But we do want to generate a process where you have enough information to make decisions about how to parse out the services. So it's important to consider building a user-friendly and useful referral process. In terms of who delivers the services, again, the key idea here is taking stock of who are your staff on board already who have school-based mental health skills, be they school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers, or even clinical staff such as MFT or clinical counselors who are on your staff. And then once you take stock of who are these trained, skilled staff that you know on your team, you can decide who will be involved at which level of intervention. An important thing that I learned in working with school-based mental health staff of all backgrounds is what is their own comfort level with doing this kind of work. Some people are very comfortable doing work with children or teens who are in crisis. Some prefer not to get too involved at the crisis level, but they're okay with doing kind of more preventative early intervention work. So it's important to take stock of that and tap into the strengths of the various professionals on your team. One more point,
Outside.
Allison, that I just wanted to make is another consideration at the tier 2 level, which is more school-wide or even district-wide, is to build your team, identify your team as being intervention, providing intervention for school crisis in the community, such as a death in the community, a trauma of some kind, a traumatic event that might happen, a suicide, and the response to the loss of a classmate or a peer. So your team can also serve that same purpose once you identify who they are.
Maria, we have a question about tier 2 mental
Oh,
health
okay.
services.
Sorry.
How do you decide that are these time-bound services? How is that decided?
So that is that's a great question. And that is completely dependent on your decision. The important thing is because tier 2 services are not mandated, they're strictly based on what resources you have, what capacity you have in terms of staff and frankly buy-in from your higher district office administration. So it is what you decide. And that's the important thing of building your infrastructure in advance so that you have a sense of, for example, at the tier 2 level, how long is enough? You know, if you're looking at an MTI model in the academic domain, generally you revisit situations in 6-week increments. And so, you know, if the student is doing well, it might be a longer period of time. If the student seems to be, you know, not progressing as well as much as you would like, or even, you know, backsliding, then you would want to build in more frequent check-ins. But the important thing is that you develop within your own community and culture what is your way of approaching tier 2 interventions, and make it transparent so that everybody understands what that system is and that everyone perceives equity and fairness in the way that the system is implemented. You think that answers it, Amanda?
Yes, I'll pass on any feedback.
Okay.
All right. And then tier 3, conceptualizing inner infrastructure, and this is at the individual level.
Right. And so tier 3 is one that is familiar and near and dear to all of our hearts, those of us who are in special education. The referral process, of course, already exists for referral to special education for children who have severe mental health needs. The important uh, I- the important ideas in the tier 3 level of service delivery is for all the team members to understand what is the menu of services that is offered in your particular district, at your particular site, through your particular program. What is that are the it's important that all the staff that's involved in making the decisions about mental health services know what the options are and how they would apply to the particular individual needs of the student that you're making decisions about, the student in front of you at that IEP meeting, and that they have the expertise to make recommendations to the team about the level of support. Some students might not need a very intensive level of support at the beginning of their at the entry level of into a mental health program. Some children might need a therapeutic placement, and if that's an option that's available in your district, that's the point at which you would make that decision. Um, the One of the beauties about building an in-house mental health infrastructure within your district is that we are able to keep more children in the district by supporting them and their mental health needs, rather than having to send them out of the district into a non-public school or even a more restrictive setting than that. And that is always the goal for all of us, is to keep our children in district as best as much as possible. So it's better for the child, and you know, again, from an administrative standpoint, it's also ultimately better for your budget. I was telling Amanda and Allison in during our preparation time that in my administrative experience, in one of my districts, we built a therapeutic middle school program that could serve up to 6 children at a time who were identified as needing a separate classroom, but with a therapeutic component. And by serving children in that classroom, either as they were identified or by bringing them back from a more restrictive placement outside the district, we were able to save $500,000 a year in non-public school tuition and fees and services outside of the district. So there are multiple reasons for considering building and strengthening your menu of options within your school district. But ultimately, again, at the tier 3 level, these decisions are, you know, the decisions about the level of service are of the IEP team members.
Oops. And then in terms of identifying who needs this level of supports and special education mental health services, or ERMS, as we tend to call it in California, their identification requires a psychoeducational evaluation. So they need to be tested cognitively and academically. And then if they qualify for special education, if they receive an IEP, and it's determined that they need mental health services, or it's suspected that they need mental health services to benefit from those supports, then we do a mental health evaluation. These can occur at the same time, or a student can have an IEP in place, and then as information, as you know, the team discusses their progress, it might come up that it seems like they need additional support in the vein of mental health, socially, emotionally, or behaviorally, and then this can be conducted after. So again, they can occur at the same time. A student doesn't have to already have an IEP. This evaluation and all the information can be gathered together. And then in terms of service considerations, you want to make sure that, just like with academic supports, that we're addressing the areas that they have a need. So if a student has, maybe participate in class, but they don't seem to really have any friends and they're withdrawn and it does seem like they're depressed and they need some help. You would want to build their social skills and maybe their self-advocacy, because that's what's appropriate. That's the area of need. Just making sure through this evaluation, and that includes interviewing teachers, getting feedback from parents, and even the student, determining where they need support. And then goals need to be appropriately created to address those areas of need. And then, as Maria was touching on earlier, keeping in mind a least restrictive environment or the continuum of services. If a school is lucky enough to have a therapeutic classroom, that helps keep them in as least restrictive of an environment as possible if they do need to be there, because you can gradually fade the amount of time they're in that classroom and integrate them into the general education setting. And also, if a student is at a non-public school, it's an easier transition if they move to a therapeutic classroom setting rather than just diving straight into the general education setting. I have seen it. I have counseled a student who went through that, and it was very, very hard on him. And as much as students might want to be fully integrated, and I think that's wonderful, it supports everyone if they can have participate on a continuum, right? And gradually get faded supports as needed. And this is a worksheet that we presented earlier. Everyone will be receiving a copy of this after the webinar, in case it helps you to figure out gaps you might have or how to ensure that you do indeed have a continuum, because sometimes people are strong at tier 1 and tier 3, but they realize they don't have much going on at tier 2 or some other configuration of that. So
And
yes.
I would piggyback on what you're saying, Allison, that tier 2 can be the biggest challenge, and across all 3 domains, not just social emotional, in terms of thinking about what are some research evidence-based interventions that can be used in order to support a child at that level, at that tier 2 level. That tier can be the most challenging.
I agree, both in terms of determining staff who can deliver it and also funding, because we know there's not much funding here, even though there is a need among the student population for it. Is there a question?
Yes, Maria and Allison. So at tier 2, is group counseling appropriate?
Absolutely. I think that that's a very good use of group counseling resources that you might be able to offer.
And group counseling these days can look so different depending on the needs of the students. I got to run an executive functioning group, which, I mean, that just targets everything. That's academics, that's behavioral, and that's social emotional, depending on it, how exactly that executive functioning is very broad, I know, but how it's manifesting itself. That builds social skills. It helps them organize in terms of just making sure they're turning in assignments. A lot of these kids, they might be, because some kids, like those with ADHD, might be more immature. They tend to be like about 3 years less mature than their same age peers. They might have some trouble making friends. And so having a smaller group where they can interact and build these relationships, then once the group technically dissolves, they still know these people. These are people they know they have something in common with. So I love tier 2. I know it's kind of like we were saying, harder to figure out what will go on there, but yeah, it's a really great area to, I think group counseling is excellent. Yeah.
I would say this is something that I learned in going through this process with my teams as well, is that it may feel daunting to think about building a whole infrastructure from beginning to end for an entire domain. I've found that in many of the cases, we already had a lot of these services and activities in existence. They were already there. The difference was they weren't organized into a progression of services, and a system of service delivery model, so that it looked like a comprehensive approach. There might be, some people might be doing groups here, and some people might be doing some kind of an early intervention there. And so a lot of it is just reconceptualizing many of the things that are already happening in the district into a comprehensive infrastructure that is organized and that can be monitored and managed, in terms of how that system is accessed by staff and students, and how the services are delivered.
Definitely.
And that's what we hope that tool is helpful in helping you to begin to conceptualize in that way. Okay, just some kind of highlights in terms of administrative and district considerations. So again, to be able to kind of take stock of what is already available in your district, in terms of the social emotional wellness and mental health activities and services that are already there, and to put them, create a structure for your district that is identifiable in terms of a program or a system that can be accessed through referral. And the same kind of look at your staffing, take stock of what staff you already have that are considered school-based mental health service providers, and see how that staff will fit into your team for service delivery. And once you have a good idea of your available staff, you can then make some decisions about what services, either through non-public agencies or individual contractors or new hires, you might need to add in order to round out your team depending on your resources. Training and awareness is very important. Once you have what I call a draft program that you're, usually in the first year to year and a half of program building, it really is a fluid situation. And so I call it a draft. But as your draft begins to take form, as your program begins to take form, it's important to introduce your program to administrative and teaching and support staff throughout the district. So there's awareness that this domain of services exists, and that they begin to understand how to access those services, how to activate them, how to recognize psychological, psychiatric, emotional distress among their students, and begin to do some educating and training with administrators and staff around these really important and pertinent issues. Supports. One of the things that I think is so important, and we tend to forget because we ourselves are mental health service providers, is how much support we need in being the service deliverer, the deliverers of services, right? So it's important to build in regular check-ins and team meetings and support mechanisms for your service providers within your district who are working on mental health and mental wellness needs with your students. It can be very draining work, especially in a virtual environment. So do be sure in building a support system for your service providers. Records, it's important to think about how you will keep your records, your mental health records. Counseling and mental health records are, depending on what state you're in, are governed by different laws, whether HIPAA or state educational laws. The best recommendation that we can give you around how to manage that is to check in with your own counsel, and to give you some guidance on how those records should be kept and maintained. Generally speaking, I know for us in California, they're because of the higher level of confidentiality, they're meant to be separate from school records. So we do, just to be on the safe side, it's always good to get legal guidance on how to maintain those records. I can also say that there are, in this kind of new field, there are electronic mental health, school-based mental health records programs that are in databases that are being developed all the time. Too, that I can I've worked with a program called Health Master, which has been on the market for about 5 or 6 years now, that you might want to take a look at. And then there's also another database called TheraNest, which it has been on the market less time than Health Master, but might be another for comparison's sake if you're interested in exploring data bases for mental health records. Those might be two that you want to look into. They all have their pros and cons. And again, in developing your program and looking at these more legal issues, we really recommend that you refer to legal counsel or other guidance at your county or SELPA level for advice. And lastly, consider Lastly, please consider building in a program evaluation mechanism. One of the things I remember learning in graduate school was about program design and development is that it takes 5 years for a new program to really take hold and to be kind of firmly established within your menu of programs. So be patient with that and build in some ways of checking in along the way, like progress updates or measurable goals, to make sure that your program is progressing in the direction that you would like it to be progressing, and so that you can make adjustments as needed when you get that feedback about how your program is going.
All right. And then in terms of locating resources, so that you don't have to build a program from scratch. And as Maria was saying, it's likely that you have a whole bunch of resources already or systems in place that you might not have considered, that you don't need to create as many supports as you might think initially. To get some good ideas, you can check your local SELPA, the State Department of Education. You can look in neighboring districts for some ideas, county mental health and state mental health guidelines. And then we have also sent you, or will send you after the webinar rather, another resource that summarizes these. This is What Works Clearinghouse. It provides a description of various programs that you might want to adopt if you don't want to have to build one from the ground up. NASP provides more information, which is the National Association for School Psychologists. I just remembered I wasn't only talking to school psychologists. They discuss the importance of school-based mental health and having a comprehensive, cohesive program. And then the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments has another link with several pieces of information regarding various programs that you might want to adopt. And I believe it's this one, although you'll be able to check it out after the webinar, that reviews various programs. It takes away that extra step in research from you having to do it. It rates them in comparison to each other. It tells what programs are responsible or appropriate for different age ranges. What you have in terms of mental health at an elementary school won't necessarily look the same as at a middle school or high school. And it's just a really concise, thoroughly researched way of getting more information.
That's a good point.
And then if you need to consult, or you need some staff training, maybe you need additional, just support for staff, especially these days because things look so different right now, then here is our contact information, which will also be available to you. And it looks like we have some time if any other questions had arisen. Amanda? Or
Yeah, no other questions coming in at the moment. But in the chat, I put a link to a survey. So if you could complete the survey, you'll be entered into a drawing. And also you can let us know if you want a certificate of attendance.
all right. Well, thank you everyone so much again for joining us today. And we look forward
Okay, it looks like, oh, I'm so sorry. It looks like the link isn't working. Let me get a new link, okay?
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for letting us know.
Raised hand. Mhm.
Let's see. Yes. Let's see. Participants, Susan. All right, Susan, you have your hand raised and I'm going to hit the allow to talk button.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I am wondering, in response to this, which has been excellent, I really want to thank both of you. I'm wondering if people are considering setting up this sort of interim or this continuum of services specifically in response to the pandemic in a time-limited way. Like if a district is not really prepared to offer this, or to think about this at this point, permanently, but whether anybody's been thinking about that, because that's what's come up for me in listening to you.
And do you mean, sorry, I just want to clarify, make sure I'm understanding the question. How things, designing some system of support specifically in terms of the pandemic that won't look the same once we're back in schools? Or are you talking about continuing, like developing something now just to, that will kind of continue?
Yeah, I don't know whether the district is going to be willing to offer this whole continuum permanently. I certainly think some practices would be put in place, but I'm thinking about just a super intensive continuum of services now in preparation for this next 2 years, for instance. That I'm just wondering if that's something that other people are thinking about, because it's certainly come up for me in listening to the two of you.
I believe so. I do think that we need to be prepared to support students because they will have gone about a year very soon now, even if school were to resume in person, without being in that traditional format. This is traumatic for a lot of students, so we do have to treat them as though they've experienced trauma. I think that being prepared to maybe have a stronger tier 2 for when students, both now and when they return, is from what I've heard, and I work with a variety of districts, it is very important, and it does seem to be on the minds of a lot of different districts, a lot of different administrators.
I know that in my former district, when we went into quarantine mode, we ramped up our both tier 1 and tier 2 immediately, and made both of those were more intensive. And so I think that Susan, you're raising a very important and relevant issue, and I wouldn't be surprised if many districts are not doing that, And I think that's a good, even if it can only be a short-term situation, it's a good practice to put in place.
I agree. And going back to that idea of prevention is better than intervention, well, intervening early is better than waiting until something becomes a large problem. And then you definitely have to have a strong system in place to address it. All right. Well, Thank you again, everyone. I appreciate you all attending and your questions, and look forward to hearing from you all in the future. All right.